Hi, I'm Stephanie, and this is the Headlines and Tidbits podcast. Here, we dust off forgotten, bizarre, and unbelievable stories pulled straight from old newspapers. In each full episode, I take a single headline that caught my attention, something strange, unsettling, or just too compelling to ignore, and walk you through the real story behind it, the people involved, what happened, and how it unfolded. However, a quick note before we get started, you may notice this episode is focused entirely on the headline story. Going forward, I'll be sharing tidbits as their own short, standalone mini episodes, which will pop up here periodically. Full headline episodes will stay just that, a complete story from start to finish. All right, let's get into today's headline. Today's story is about the murder of Mike Defino, and this took place in Juneau, Alaska, and it happened on New Year's Eve. So happy New Year's. We'll be telling a New Year's Eve murder mystery. And the headline that grabbed my attention was Mike Defino shot in back by Facicelli. Tragedy in Douglas yesterday in which one countryman kills another. So this incident took place on December 31st, 1915 in Douglas, Alaska. Nick Facicelli and Mike Defino were outside of the Owl restaurant in Douglas around 2:30 in the afternoon, when Nick walked up to Mike and shot him 4 times with a .38 caliber revolver. An Alaska newspaper called this murder, quote, one of the most cold-blooded murders to happen in the North. So let's dive into this story and figure out the background of all of this. Mike Defino was born on November 3rd, 1863 in Italy. No records on this man other than prison records really exist. I could find his birth date, and that was about it. But thanks to prison records, I do know that on February 6, 1912, Mike started serving a sentence of 20 months for, quote, and this is their words, selling liquor to an Indian. And I found his prisoner intake form, and it has a whole list of kind of his identifying features. And basically it just lists a lot of scars on him. So I think he had been in a few fights, if I had to take a guess. And it even came with his mugshot, which I'll post on Instagram. Now, I was able to gather through newspapers that when he first got to Alaska, he worked as a woodcutter, and then he worked in the mines. This was actually his second time serving a prison sentence for selling liquor to, again, quote, Indians. In 1910, he served 8 months in an Alaskan jail for this offense. Now, when it comes to Nick Facicelli, there is even less information out there on him. So with that being said, let's just start talking about the murder. Like I said earlier, this happened on New Year's Eve. Nick Facicelli walked up to Mike Defino, put the gun against his back, and shot him in the heart. Defino, of course, scrambled away from Nick and screamed at him, "Don't shoot." But Nick actually ended up firing 4 more shots, and Mike was struck on the right side of his chest and also right above the left breast. When Nick fired his first shot, he held the gun so close to Mike that the gunpowder actually burned his clothes. And Charles Gable, he was a carpenter who was working across the street. He witnessed the shooting. He said Nick ran off after he fired the last bullet and said that he went so fast it looked like he ran into the water. So if you think about Alaska, these little towns, you know, there's water all around him, and I guess he just took off so fast it looked like he ran right into the water. And after this, local citizens and volunteers set out to look for Nick. Now, this is December in Alaska, so there was obviously snow on the ground, and the citizens, because of this, were able to track Nick due to his footprints in the snow. They tracked him to a shed that was behind the general store, and apparently this shed had a lavatory, so a bathroom in it. I'm kind of just wondering if this was just an outhouse. But anyways, the citizens had a feeling he was in there. So they shot off the lock and then, quote, fired off a few shots through the door. I don't know, maybe they were worried he was going to come out shooting at them since they knew he had a gun. So once they caught him, they took him to the city jail. And when the police apprehended him from the citizens, they said Nick appeared unconcerned and just had a big smile on his face. And then they took Mike's body to Sully's morgue. From the interviews with the police, they figured out that all of this started over money. Now, Nick didn't speak English, so that was probably interesting. Hopefully, they had to have had a translator there. Probably just grabbed another Italian who was working in the area to translate. So apparently, Mike and Nick, they knew each other through working in the mines. They both worked at the same mine at one point, the Perseverance mine. And Mike lent Nick $18, which is about $600 today. and Nick didn't pay him back. A few days before the shooting, Mike approached Nick and asked for his money. Nick told him he didn't have any cash, but he did have a check for $55, which is close to $2,000 today. So Nick gave the check to Mike to cash, but Nick told him, I need my $37 back, because remember, he only owed Mike $18. But Mike failed to do this. Apparently, he just cashed the check and kept all of the money. And Nick told him, I need that money so that I can pay for my living expenses here, but I also need to send money back to Italy where my wife and child are. So Nick went searching for him, and he found Mike in a saloon. The paper I read said that Mike spent the money, quote, getting intoxicated. Now, Nick at this point was obviously really irritated, but took Mike back to Douglas so that they could return to work. And Mike promised to withdraw the money and pay Nick back. So a couple of days later, Mike withdrew the money, but went straight to the saloon and spent the money there. When Nick found out about this, he tracked Mike down, and this was when he took his revenge. So needless to say, Nick was booked on a murder charge and was held without bail. A few days after the shooting, on January 4th, Mike was buried at the Douglas Cemetery, but the very next day, his body was actually dug up because the federal authorities, who were now somehow involved, demanded that an autopsy be done. So H.V. Soley, who ran the morgue, buried Mike at the cemetery, but as he was leaving the cemetery, a United States Marshal showed up and demanded the body be exhumed and given an autopsy. The Alaskan Daily Empire detailed this autopsy quite well. And I'm actually going to read that right now. The autopsy revealed that Defino was hit by 4 bullets. One entered the left side of the back of the head, about 1 inch above the bottom of the lobe of his left ear. So he not only got shot in the back, but also the back of the head. Another bullet entered his left shoulder, about 4 inches from the top, and another one entered the right base of his neck. And this was a deep flesh wound, but no bones were touched. And another bullet entered the left side of his chest at about the second rib and about 6 inches from his middle median line, and passed down through his stomach. So, like I said, they actually went into a lot more detail, but I won't go through all of that. And based off of this autopsy, they held an inquest and decided to move forward with prosecuting Nick. Now, Nick, he ended up declining mentally while he was in prison awaiting trial. They had to send him into a sanitarium, and he was guarded 24/7. However, by March of 1916, Nick had been deemed sane, and the trial was ready to proceed. A Dr. Dave Vine said that Nick had an excitable temperament and was highly emotional, but sane and could stand trial. However, in April, they had to push Nick's trial back to be held later on in the summer because the authorities had finally caught Alaska's first serial killer, Edward Cross. So I'm going to tell his story just really briefly. So between 1912 and 1915, a number of single, unattached men mysteriously disappeared in southeast Alaska. The few law enforcement officials in the territory were baffled, but a suspect finally emerged in the fall of 1915, and this was Edward Cross. Now, his name was actually Edward Slomke, who had served in the U.S. Army from 1897 to 1902, and he actually deserted the Army in 1902. So authorities found that over the years, Cross had recovered the assets of these murdered men. His trial started in the spring of 1917, but since none of his victims were ever found, jurors found him guilty of kidnapping, robbery, and forgery, but not murder. However, he was sentenced to die by hanging. So I don't know, different laws, I guess, back then. However, he had other plans. He sawed through the bars of his cell and escaped from the Juneau Federal Jail 2 days before his slated execution. And this launched the most widespread manhunt in the territory's history. Fishing fleets in every southeast community mobilized to block his escape out of Alaska. And a few days later, a homesteader collected the $1,000 reward by killing Cross after the fugitive stepped off of a stolen skiff onto the beach near his property. So to this day, law enforcement actually believe the extent of Cross's criminal activities, if ever known, would be one of the most startling in American crime history. Anyways, with all of this being said, Nick had to wait quite a while for his trial, and probably because of this, he again mentally declined. And in August of 1916, a grand jury commission deemed Nick insane, and he was sent to the Tabor Asylum, which I believe was in Oregon. And because of all of this, the murder charges were dropped. I did read in a paper that if Nick ever left the asylum, charges would be brought up again. But that's all I could find on these two. Like I said, I had trouble finding information on their background. It was Alaska in the early 1900s, and it was considered a territory, so not a lot of newspapers, that kind of stuff. But even after Nick was sent to the asylum, I never saw anything on him. I can't even find a death record, so I would assume that he probably remained in the asylum until he died. And that's where we will leave today's story. I hope everybody has had a great holiday season with all of their loved ones, and Happy New Year. And thank you so much for listening to Headlines and Tidbits. If you enjoyed this episode, consider following or subscribing so you don't miss future stories pulled from the pages of the past. See you next time.